Well, hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to give you the conversation starters that will help you be the life of any dinner party. That's right, we're going to be talking about router base plates. Now this is a follow-up video to a video I did recently about the basic and safe use of routers. In the comments for that video, I was asked about router base plates. What are the considerations that should go into picking the kind of base plate that would be right for you? Well, I'd like to describe that in today's video. These are all router base plates that were made specifically for this router. I make these myself. I even sell them on Etsy. And given my experience with router base plates, I'd like to walk you through some of the criteria that you should look at when you're considering making a purchase of a router base plate for yourself. We're going to go over the connections to the routers themselves. We're going to go over the materials and the shapes of the various types of base plates that you'd use and when they are useful. And then we're going to talk a little bit about specifically the center hole cuts and what you should be looking for in those as well. Let's begin by talking about how they're connected to the router itself. So let's take a look specifically at this compact or palm router. Removing the plate is as simple as finding the appropriate screwdriver for the connections and unscrewing all of them. If you want to replace it with a different plate, you pick that up, find the countersunk side, let the countersunk side be down, orient it the way it should be so that it fits with the screws, put those screws in and tighten them by hand first, not all the way tight, so that you get all four of the screws in place. And then once you've positioned it exactly where you want it to be, take your screwdriver and tighten it down the rest of the way. Now you'll note that I have a paper backing on this one. I'm only doing that for the video so that you can see a little bit better the shape that's going on. Normally they'll be clear. One last note about that is that these routers sometimes have 2 or 3 different types of connection patterns to them. On this DeWalt, you can see that there are these 4 holes that I was using for this particular base plate. But if you look closely, you'll notice that there's actually quite a few more screw holes in them. That's because it supports different connection types for different types of base plates. DeWalt does this commonly. In fact, in some cases, it has places where you can support it with a square like this with 4 connections, and in other places where you do 3 or 2, and sometimes it's on the same router base. So if you've ordered a particular router base plate that is made for your model and it has a different number of screws than your current base plate, that might be okay. Take it off first. Just try to line up where you think it should fit or could fit and put the connection back together and it may work. Once you have made sure that you're getting a base plate that actually fits the connection pattern for your router base, what about material? Let's talk about that next. There are 4 common types of material that are used for router base plates. 3 of those come from the router manufacturers themselves, and you can see those 3 here. This one is made of a stamped metal on this Bosch. This one is an acrylic. It is the most common type and the kind that I make. And this one is a different kind of plastic. It's called HDPE. And this is also made by the manufacturer. The 4th kind of router base plate is actually just wood. And these are mostly done in people's shops themselves. There's no problem with you making your own router base plates for the particular application that you need. If you have something very unique, you can cut it out. You can try and match up these holes and put screws through in a countersunk hole that you've made yourself. I will warn you that that is actually more difficult than it seems. Unless you make them very sloppy, those holes, it is actually quite difficult to get them to line up just perfectly. When I make mine, I use the precision of a laser cutter to do that for me. But you can do it in a pinch, especially if it's something that you just need temporarily. The biggest downside to using wood, though, is the fact that it provides a lot more friction on its surface. These materials are a lot more smooth and thus have a lot less friction. So you should keep that in mind. If you're going to work with a wooden one, it's probably only a temporary application, not something you want to do all the time. Beyond the consideration of the friction, the next thing that you should be thinking about with the material is its strength. Now, of these 3, the strongest material by far is this metal. However, because it is such a thin stamped metal, That strength is really only good if the router base plate itself comes close to matching the router base that it's attached to. If you go much further, because the material is thin, when you're routing out a pocket and this router base itself fits into that pocket and you're relying on the base plate to keep it flush with the top of the board, you'll see some deflection of the plate as it pushes in. The thin metal doesn't do very well for this strength with deflection, even though it's quite strong in terms of its durability. A step up from that is these two plastics. Now these are a 1/4 inch material, both this HDPE and this acrylic. And they provide a step up in terms of the deflection strength, especially for these smaller palm routers. There's not much weight to them, and you're typically working with a smaller cut anyway. So these give you the flexibility of starting to go out maybe a little bit bigger. However, if you get to using a really heavy router and you're using a very wide router base, even this 1/4 inch acrylic and plastic might cause a little bit of deflection. The way to get around that is to actually just upgrade the thickness of this material. So these acrylic router base plates most commonly come in 1/4 of an inch, but you can, if you'd like to, also get them at 3/8 of an inch. And at 3/8 of an inch, you've cut off enough deflection that it can be used in almost all of the cases. So that's the things to keep in mind. The strength on the router base itself, the deflection as you get a little bit away with larger pockets, and the friction and durability of that plate when it's attached and being used by you in your shop. Okay, so now let's talk about shape. Now, while those criteria that you had before, the connection pattern was kind of a requirement for what you were going to work with shape you have a lot of options. And by far the most common option is the circle. It is what comes with nearly all routers themselves when they give you the base plate to work with. The handy thing about having a circle is that you can make that cut bringing your router across, and you can twist and turn as you go, and it's still going to make that straight cut for you. So if that's such a handy thing, why aren't they all circles? Well, there are some limitations to using this as a circle. And that's especially true if the guide that you're using is actually a part of the piece itself and has some inconsistencies in it. For instance, if you have a straight line guide, but maybe it has some little jags inside of it, that's just part of its pattern, well, this particular round base would dip into each one of those jags, divots, whatever they happen to be. If instead you had a square router base, you could use that against this straight line, and it will continue to follow that line on both sides and ignore any little tiny inconsistencies that are in them. Well, maybe you want the best of both worlds. If that's the case, this is probably the second most common thing that I sell when I make them. And this is what is called a D plate because it's generally in the shape of the letter D. It gives you a round side to work with as well as a straight side to work with. Kind of the best of both worlds. The other thing, because of the size of these particular things, you can feel most confident if you're working with a base plate that is right up against the base of the router, you know you're not getting a lot of deflection. But if you're working with larger holes, then you need a larger base plate. And that's where things like these two come in. Now this is the one that I actually make the most of and sell to people because it's not what typically comes with a router base, and it's very handy for working with larger pockets. If the pocket size itself is similar to that of the palm router's base, you're going to have a lot of trouble controlling its height up and down because it's going to start dipping on one side or another. But if you have a wider surface to cover with that base, you're covered, and it will stay a lot more consistent. So these are very popular and they're very useful. There are some eccentric shapes like this one. I don't see a lot of use for it, but it could come into place where you happen to have some sort of shape you have to fit into that has some sort of angle next to it as well that it has to work with. The point is that you can make basically any shape you want to. So the wide plate gives you the ability to cover a larger surface, But you also should think about the offset. This one I call a teardrop shape. And you might be saying, why would you have something that looks like this? Well, the point of this one is maybe you have a lot of cover on one side and not a lot of cover on the other. You can put your pressure down here on this side that's off of the router and not worry about the fact that it doesn't have support on this other end. So the centering of the router, the size of it compared to its base, and one other consideration is whether or not you want to put a handle on it. So this teardrop shaped one actually has support for putting a handle on, so you can kind of work with that. I try and make that optional because sometimes it's just easier to hold it. And then of course with these wider ones, you can potentially have two handles so you can guide all of it around. So there are a lot of options and not all of them are appropriate for every condition. You have to think about what kind of work you're going to be doing with your router and then purchase the one that makes the most sense for you. So I hope I've gone over the things to consider in terms of those shapes. The very last thing, and it is important, is to talk about the center holes themselves. So there are more considerations than you might think originally when it comes to the center cuts inside of a router base plate. The first and most obvious of those, of course, is the circle that it makes up the fitting for the router bit to go through. And the radius of that circle is the important part. It needs to be big enough to fit whatever router bit that you're using, and they vary widely in size. But if you make it too large, you can get to the point where you can't work with smaller pieces because it'll start slipping through. So the answer may be, in many cases, that you need multiple router base plates just to handle the different types of bit and wood that you're working with. But the size of this hole is not the only consideration. Imagine that you're using this particular hole right here with a 1.5" bit. You're covering almost all of that material. When you're cutting out the material from the wood beneath it, where is all the chips and the dust going to go? So the second consideration is the dust holes. And that's what these slots are here. In this particular model, it takes smaller dust from a smaller router and brings it up hopefully through your vacuuming system. This is a common way for the DeWalt. You'll see that on most of the ones that they make and sell with their routers. Other companies do it in a different way. Milwaukee, Cobalt, and Makita, just off the top of my head, tend to use something that looks more like this. They've cut a divot out that matches a divot actually in the router base itself that you attach right here, and it tries to put all of the dust that's coming up into this one place so that their vacuuming system, which is made to work from that same side, will bring the dust out. There are several more varieties of dust holes that can come with plates, some that don't work with compact routers but only work on the larger, mid-size to larger routers. So it's always one of the things you need to consider is where your dust is going to go with the particular cut that you're doing. One final and very important consideration when you're purchasing a base plate is what sort of templating system you're going to want to work with. Now it may be that you're not working with a templating system at all, in which case you just pick the size of the center cut hole that works best with your router bits. But let's say that you need to follow the inside of a template and you can't use the bearing bushing on a particular router bit itself. You need to use an external system. Well, that's what I have here. This one is the Porter Cable compatible system, and this is the Bosch compatible system. Why are there two? Well, they do different things. For one, the Porter Cable system is smaller and works better with these compact routers. The Bosch style system is big enough that it really doesn't even fit on those. But because of that limitation, it means that the bushing sizes themselves go up to about a maximum of this size, whereas with the Bosch, you can get something almost twice that size. So by default, when I'm making these for people, I always add these two holes here, which are the connection for the Bosch style system if you're buying a mid-size or larger Bosch plate. You can also request them for any other router because this will work with other routers other than the Bosch. It just doesn't tend to work with these small ones. The most common system is the Porter Cable system. And you have to get a base plate that is specifically designed to work with that system. You can see that this particular base plate has a countersunk center hole. And the reason for that is that this bushing fits in there, and then you take a nut and tighten it down into place. And now you have a bumper that you can work with. So it is important that you, if that is what you want as your application, is to be working with templates, that you get a router base plate that has a center that supports it. The last thing to keep in mind is that there are some specialty router base plates that have a very specific purpose for a very specific type of cut. The router table is an instance of that. A router table is actually just this flat plate here as a table, and it has a hole cut out in it in a standard size. Now you can get these like I make, which fit that standard size, and they don't do much other than hold your router in place. But you can get fancier ones like this, which is a metal one with a gearing system beneath it, a bunch of locking mechanisms and pins and ways of putting special plates in. If you do that, you have a very more sophisticated router plate that works with the router table. In addition to that, there are special jigs, some for cutting tenons, and others even simple, like this still flat one, but quite a bit larger than your router base itself. And the purpose of this is to give you a pivot point around which you can cut a perfect circle. So now that we've reached the end of the video, I hope I've accomplished my goal and given you all the greatest conversation starters you can imagine for your upcoming dinner party. And let's face it, if those aren't working, then you're probably hanging out with the wrong people. I'd love to have those conversations with you, and if we can't do it in person, perhaps you can visit me in the comments section and leave me a note about this video. And if you have any questions about router base plates, I'll try my best to answer them there. If you like this video, you might like other of the videos that I've done on the basic and safe use of woodshop tools, or perhaps some of my build videos. Hit subscribe to be able to find those a little bit easier and to make it so other people can find them as well. I appreciate you doing that and for watching this video, and I hope to see you on the next one.